The digital display on the oven read 11:42 p.m., casting a faint green glow across the kitchen linoleum, when Toby stopped panting. He didn't just quiet down. The rhythmic, wet sound of his respiration ceased entirely, as if an internal switch had been flipped. He was standing near the sliding glass door that led out to the backyard patio, a 70-pound mutt, half golden retriever, half German shepherd, and usually a creature of clumsy, perpetual motion. 10 seconds ago, he had been obsessively nudging a worn-out tennis ball against the aluminum track of the door. Now the ball sat motionless against the glass, and Toby was locked into a posture so rigid it looked like taxidermy. I was standing at the sink, running hot water over a coffee mug, staring out the window into the dense, pitch-black woods of the Oregon Cascades. The nearest neighbor is 3 miles down a winding gravel road. It's the kind of isolation you either crave or flee from. I had moved out here to work remotely, to escape the relentless noise of the city, to just be left alone with my logistics spreadsheets and my dog. Usually the silence out here was a profound comfort, but right then, the absolute absence of sound in my own kitchen felt like a heavy, physical weight pressing against my eardrums. "Toby?" I said. My voice sounded weirdly muffled, swallowed instantly by the room. He didn't twitch. His ears, normally swiveling like radar dishes at the slightest rustle of a squirrel in the brush, were pinned flat against his skull. His brown eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on a blank patch of drywall between the refrigerator and the hallway arch. I turned the faucet off. The water pressure hissed down to a slow drip and then stopped. "Hey, buddy, what's wrong?" I grabbed a dish towel, drying my hands as I took a step toward him. The ambient temperature in the kitchen plummeted. My thermostat was set to a comfortable 68 degrees Fahrenheit. But within a span of maybe 3 seconds, I could see my own breath pluming in the air before me in thick white clouds. A sharp, metallic scent flooded my sinuses, like the smell of a blown electrical transformer, all burnt copper and dry static electricity. I reached out to touch the scruff of his neck. My fingers were exactly 2 inches away from his golden fur when the first sound broke the silence. It was a sharp, dry click. It sounded exactly like a heavy metal deadbolt sliding into a rusted strike plate. It emanated from the base of Toby's spine. I froze, my hand hovering midair. Then came another click, and another. A rapid, mathematical sequence of snapping sounds that didn't resemble anything organic or biological. There was no wet tearing of flesh, no agonizing whimper, no blood pooling on the linoleum. It was a seamless, horrifyingly geometric folding of mass. Toby's hind legs snapped backward, the joints reversing their orientation with the clean, precise sound of a heavy wooden puzzle box sliding into a new, impossible configuration. His fur didn't fall out, it retracted. It slipped beneath his skin as if pulled inward by an invisible, meticulously calibrated mechanism. His spine elongated, straightening vertically, pulling the bulk of his body upward. His front paws lifted from the floor, the bones within them shifting, elongating, fusing, and splitting again to form pale, hairless, human fingers. I stumbled backward, my heel catching the edge of the anti-fatigue mat by the sink. I hit the lower cabinets hard, jarring my tailbone, but I couldn't look away. I couldn't even draw enough breath into my lungs to scream. My brain was frantically cycling through rational explanations, a localized hallucination, a severe neurological event, a waking nightmare, discarding them one by one as the sheer physical reality of the situation crushed them. The skull widened. The snout collapsed inward, flattening out, the bone reshaping itself like clay in the hands of an invisible sculptor. The tennis ball rolled slightly on the floor, disturbed by the shifting air currents. The entire process took maybe 45 seconds. When the mechanical clicking finally ceased, my 70-pound dog was gone. Kneeling on my kitchen floor was an elderly man in a perfectly pressed, faded gray institutional jumpsuit. His silver hair was combed neatly to the right, plastered down as if with water. His skin was pale, mapped with familiar liver spots and deep wrinkles I had known for the first 20 years of my life. He reached up with a steady, unhurried hand, adjusted the stiff collar of his jumpsuit, and slowly blinked. His eyes were a clouded, milky white, utterly blind yet entirely focused. It was my grandfather, Walter. He had passed away 5 years ago in a hospice facility back in Ohio. His heart had simply worn out after decades of quiet, monotonous living. I had spoken at his funeral. I had watched the polished oak casket lower into the ground. Walter did not look around the room with the confusion of a resurrected man. He did not look at me with the warm, crinkling smile that used to greet me when I visited him on Sunday afternoons. He looked completely blank, empty, like a computer terminal waiting for an input command. He uncrossed his legs, placed his palms flat on the cold linoleum, and pushed himself up. His movements were stiff but perfectly balanced. He walked over to the wooden dining chair pushed into the corner of the room, pulled it out, and sat down. He folded his hands perfectly symmetrically on the tabletop. "Audio and visual receptors are stabilized," he said. His voice was exactly the same gravelly baritone I remembered, but the cadence was entirely wrong. It was stripped of all inflection, all humanity. It sounded like an automated customer service prompt reading a generated script. "Biological tether is secure. Designation Subject 404-D. Commencing transmission." I pressed my back against the cabinets, my hands gripping the edge of the counter behind me so hard my knuckles ached. "Grandpa?" I whispered, the words scraping out of my dry throat like sandpaper. Walter's milky eyes fixed on me. They didn't focus on my face. They seemed to stare right through my skull, looking at a point 3 feet behind me in the dark yard. "The familial designation is irrelevant to this broadcast," the flat voice replied, completely unbothered by my terror. "I am utilizing the memory engrams stored within this biological avatar's proximity to facilitate communication. I am Subject 404-D. I require you to obtain a writing implement and a ledger. Time is a highly restricted resource in this sector. Do not force me to repeat the requisition." I didn't move. I couldn't. I was a 30-year-old man sitting in a suburban house, looking at a dead man who had just geometrically unfolded out of my rescue dog. "Your heart rate is currently elevated to 124 beats per minute," Subject 404-D stated, his head tilting exactly 1 inch to the left. "Panic is a superfluous expenditure of metabolic energy. It also creates a localized acoustic disturbance that could attract unwanted monitoring. Regulate your breathing and obtain the writing implement. The stability of your terrestrial geometry depends on the archiving of this data." The absolute, unyielding authority in his voice hit a deeply ingrained reflex. Without thinking, I scrambled to my feet, my knees shaking so violently I had to lean heavily against the counter. I edged my way down the kitchen layout, keeping my eyes locked on the gray-suited figure sitting in my dining chair. I yanked open the junk drawer, grabbed a blue ballpoint pen and a yellow legal pad I used for grocery lists, and slid back into the room. I didn't sit at the table with him. I stood behind the kitchen island, placing the pad on the granite, gripping the pen like it was a weapon. "I have it," I managed to say. "Acknowledge," Walter said. He didn't blink. "The prevailing mortal theories regarding the afterlife are mathematically and structurally incorrect. There is no fire. There is no sulfur. There are no entities enforcing moral punishment. The concept of morality is a localized human survival trait and holds zero weight in the primary administrative complex." He paused, staring at the blank face of the refrigerator. "What your theological texts refer to as hell is not a punitive realm. It is a subterranean, multidimensional containment facility. It is an endless bureaucratic complex constructed to hold anomalies that violate the fundamental laws of physics and thermodynamics." I stared at him, the pen hovering over the yellow paper. I don't understand." "Write this down," he commanded, the volume of his voice increasing slightly, carrying a heavy, vibrating resonance that made the water in the dog bowl ripple. Protocol Transmission Alpha. The complex spans an estimated volume that eclipses the mass of your sun, existing in folded spatial pockets beneath the Earth's crust. It is constructed entirely of seamless gray concrete, acoustic drop ceilings, and fluorescent lighting that hums at a constant 60 Hz. It is an endless office, an infinite laboratory, and human souls are not the prisoners. Human souls are the clerical staff. You're working there? I asked, my reality fracturing completely, unable to process the sheer mundane horror of his words. Correct. Upon biological cessation 5 years ago, I was processed through Intake Sector 4. I was issued a gray suit, a clipboard, and assigned to Sublevel 812. My eternal function is to log the degrading stability of containment cells. The universe is inherently unstable. It constantly generates errors, primordial biological contagions, nonlinear temporal predators, entities that predate the concept of light. They are captured and brought down into the complex. The facility holds them, and the system is currently experiencing catastrophic failure. For the next 2 hours, I wrote. I filled page after page of the legal pad, the blue ink smudging against the side of my hand as I frantically transcribed his monotonous dictation. I didn't stop to question it anymore. The clinical, exhausting detail he provided left no room for doubt. It was too specific, too meticulously drafted in its horror to be the product of my own fractured mind. He described Sector 9, a massive cryogenic wing kept at absolute zero. In Sector 9, we store the biological anomalies colloquially known in your indigenous folklore as the Wendigo. Walter droned, his hands resting perfectly flat on his thighs. They are not cursed spirits. They are a parasitic fungal network that completely replaces the mammalian nervous system, driving the host to consume ambient thermal energy. We currently have 412 specimens suspended in liquid helium. They never sleep. They require constant auditory suppression. If a sound wave exceeding 20 decibels interacts with their containment glass, the vibrations agitate the spores, causing a localized reality breach. I have filed over 2,000 incident reports regarding microfractures in the glass. Management has rejected all requisitions for repair. He described things that had no earthly names. He spoke of designation 44 Delta, a shifting mass of geometric shadows that feeds entirely on the concept of memory, locked in a room where the walls are made of mirrors reflecting absolute nothingness. He talked about Leviathan-class anomalies, deep-sea biological errors the size of continents, kept in massive, pressurized aquatic tanks that require billions of human souls just to maintain the complex mathematical filtration systems. I am speaking to you now because I located a structural loophole in the facility's communication array, Walter explained, his dead eyes suddenly locking onto mine. It was 2:15 a.m. On the night of a full lunar cycle, the gravitational pull creates a micro-fissure in the barrier between the terrestrial plane and the complex's data centers. I routed my consciousness through the bioelectrical field of your canine. The genetic structure provided the exact resonance frequency required for a temporary avatar. Why? I asked, my voice cracking, tears of sheer existential terror prickling my eyes. Why are you telling me this? I'm just a guy who does supply chain logistics. What am I supposed to do with this information? You are a terrestrial anchor, Subject 404-D replied smoothly. By documenting the exact structural vulnerabilities of the complex, you are creating a backup drive in the physical world. Information possesses spatial weight. By holding the knowledge, you solidify the containment grid. The administrative system is failing, the wardens are overwhelmed, the entities are testing the perimeter. If they breach the surface, your reality lacks the mathematical framework to survive them. At 3:42 a.m., Walter stopped talking mid-sentence. He looked toward the window where the heavy silver light of the full moon was beginning to dip behind the dense tree line. Lunar alignment is degrading below 98%. He stated. Connection terminating. I will resume the upload in precisely 29.5 days. Maintain the archive. Before I could protest, his jaw snapped shut. His milky eyes rolled back into his skull. The horrifying, frictionless folding process began again, playing in reverse. The gray suit seemed to melt, retexturing itself into coarse golden fur. His spine arched forward, the bones cracking back into a quadrupedal alignment, with a series of sharp, dry snaps. The skull elongated, the fingers fused back into paws. In less than a minute, Toby was lying on the linoleum. He took a massive, shuddering breath, as if he had been submerged underwater for 3 hours. He scrambled to his feet, his nails clattering against the floor. He shook his head violently, his ears flapping, and looked up at me with his normal, dopey brown eyes. He let out a soft whine, trotted over to the kitchen island, and nudged my knee with his wet nose. I dropped the pen, slid down the side of the cabinets, and buried my face in my hands. That was the first month. I spent the next 3 weeks trapped in a state of paranoid delusion. I convinced myself it was a localized seizure. I drove to Portland and paid out of pocket for an MRI and a full neurological workup. The scans came back pristine. I called a guy to inspect my HVAC system for carbon monoxide leaks. He found nothing. I took Toby to Dr. Lin, our local vet, for a comprehensive blood panel and joint x-rays. The vet told me he was a perfectly healthy, robust animal. I threw the yellow legal pad into the outdoor trash bin, only to walk out at 2 in the morning in the freezing rain to dig it out, shivering in my pajamas, terrified that throwing it away would cause the universe to collapse. I couldn't look at Toby the same way. Every time he sat too still, every time he stared at a blank wall or paused before eating his kibble, my heart would hammer against my ribs. I waited for the clicking to start. But he was just a dog. He chased tennis balls, barked at the mail carrier, and slept at the foot of my bed. Then the calendar turned. The next full moon arrived. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with the lights blazing, a fresh notebook open on the coffee table, and 3 cups of black coffee in my system. At 11:45 p.m., Toby stopped panting. He froze mid-step. The temperature in the room plummeted. The mechanical folding happened just as silently, just as perfectly. And there was Walter, sitting cross-legged on the rug, smoothing his gray suit. Designation: Subject 404-D, resuming temporal broadcast. It became my reality, a horrifying, mind-bending routine. Every 29.5 days, I lost my dog for a few hours and gained a monotonous, dead bureaucrat who dictated the administrative failures of a subterranean nightmare. I learned about the wardens. They are the security apparatus, Walter told me during the 3rd month. They are not biological. They do not have faces. They are humanoid constructs woven from compressed acoustic waves and hardened time. They wear hazmat suits that reflect only the gray corridors. They enforce order. But their algorithms are outdated. They are prioritizing paperwork over structural repairs. I learned about the staffing shortages in Sector 12, where colossal, winged entities made of petrified wood and burning copper were constantly throwing their bodies against reinforced titanium bulkheads. We do not sleep, Walter droned, his eyes unblinking. Fatigue is a biological flaw. We calculate, we file, we observe. Last week, a Level 4 containment unit in Sector 22 ruptured. A primordial entity, classified as a non-linear temporal predator, escaped into the staff cafeteria. It consumed 3,000 administrative souls before the automated defense systems localized the threat. The souls were not destroyed. They were digested and stretched across infinite, looping moments of agony. I had to file the incident report. The forms required 6 signatures. It took 4 terrestrial years to process. By the 5th month, my spare bedroom looked like the walls of a conspiracy theorist. I had pinned blueprints to the drywall, sketching out the sectors based on Walter's meticulous descriptions. I mapped the endless concrete labyrinth. I noted the specific temperatures, the atmospheric pressures, the exact dimensions of the containment cells in inches and feet. I took a leave of absence from my job. My entire existence became anchored to the lunar cycle. The weight of the knowledge was crushing. To walk outside, to drive into town and look at people complaining about traffic or spilling their coffee, knowing that just beneath the thin crust of reality, there was a mechanized, decaying prison holding back the end of everything. Knowing that humanity's continued existence relied on the clerical accuracy of dead accountants working under flickering fluorescent lights. My obsession grew into intense paranoia. I started taking measurements of my own house. Standard drywall is 1/2 inch thick. Insulation is maybe another 3.5 inches of fiberglass. Exterior siding. It was nothing. A paper box. If the things in those cells ever got out, my house offered zero protection. I found myself obsessively researching acoustic dampening materials. I drove to a hardware store and bought 50 pounds of rock salt and industrial soundproofing foam, lining the walls of my basement without knowing exactly what I intended to do with it. But with every transfer, the atmosphere in my house degraded further. The temperature in the living room permanently dropped to 54 degrees. My furnace ran constantly, racking up massive heating bills, but the thermostat never registered an increase. A sharp metallic smell, like old pennies and burnt wiring, clung to the curtains and the upholstery. Toby became lethargic. He stopped playing. His golden coat began to look dull, graying at the edges. The biological toll of acting as a multidimensional conduit was slowly draining him. Then came last night. The weather was brutal. A heavy, unseasonal Pacific storm had rolled into the valley around 9 o'clock, dumping sheets of freezing rain against the siding of the house. The thunder was deep and resonant, shaking the floorboards. The full moon was completely obscured by thick, black clouds, but the gravitational alignment was still there. The pole doesn't care about the weather. At 11:30 p.m., I was sitting at the dining table. I had 3 pens lined up perfectly parallel to the edge of the wood. My notebook was open to a fresh page. Toby shifted, collapsed inward, and transformed. Walter stood up from the floor. He didn't walk over to the chair. He didn't sit down. "Designation Subject 404-D, he said. But his voice was different. The steady, pre-recorded cadence was gone. There was a slight, almost imperceptible tremor in his words. The flat, robotic tone cracked. "Temporal broadcast. Compromised." I frowned, clicking my pen. "Compromised? What do you mean?" Walter didn't look at me. He was staring at the doorway that led from the living room into the dark hallway. His hands, usually resting calmly at his sides, were trembling. The gray fabric of his suit seemed to vibrate. "A discrepancy has been detected in the data stream," he said, speaking much faster than usual. "Management has noticed the localized reality distortions occurring in Sector 4. They ran a diagnostic on the subetheric communications relay. They traced the unauthorized upload. They know I am broadcasting." My stomach dropped, a cold weight plunging into my gut. Who knows? The wardens? Worse, Walter whispered. It was the first time I had ever heard him whisper. It sounded like dry leaves scraping across a tombstone. It was the voice of a terrified old man. "Internal security. They have deployed a cleaner." The temperature in the living room didn't just drop, it crashed. I could suddenly see my breath misting in the air before me in thick white plumes. The digital thermostat on the wall beeped frantically, its display scrolling down in real time. 60 degrees. 50. 40. 32. Frost bloomed across the glass of the television screen with an audible crackle. "Grandpa, what is a cleaner?" I asked, standing up so fast my chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "Hush!" Walter snapped, his dead eyes suddenly locking onto mine with a terrifying, desperate intensity. Lower your vocal amplitude. Immediately. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering in my throat like a trapped bird. I lowered my voice to a bare, raspy whisper. What is it? Entity classification, null sweeper, he murmured, his eyes darting back to the dark hallway. It is not a soul. It is not an anomaly. It is a manufactured defense mechanism. It does not possess a physical form in the traditional geometry. It is a localized void construct. It feeds on sensory output, light, and sound. It hunts by consuming the physics of observation, and it has followed the broadcast signal to this exact terrestrial coordinate. The lights in the living room flickered violently. A deep, heavy hum vibrated through the floorboards, completely distinct from the thunder outside. It felt like standing next to a massive industrial power transformer. The vibration made my teeth ache. It is in your structure, Walter said, his voice entirely devoid of hope. It has entered the perimeter. What do we do? I panicked, looking around for a weapon. A baseball bat? A kitchen knife? How do you fight a void construct? You do exactly as I dictate, or you will be erased, Walter stated coldly, the bureaucrat fighting through the terror. Not killed, erased. Your matter will be converted into raw data and filed into the deletion archives. Listen to me carefully. The cleaner is drawn to sensory emissions. You must eliminate all light and artificial sound in this structure immediately. Sever the electrical current. The breaker box, I whispered, pointing down toward the floor. It's in the basement. Proceed. Do not run. Heavy footfalls generate seismic vibrations. Move with minimal atmospheric displacement. Go. I nodded, terrified out of my mind. I crept out from behind the dining table. The hallway leading to the basement door was swallowed in shadow. The house was already plunging into a bizarre, unnatural silence. Even the sound of the rain outside seemed muted, muffled by an invisible, oppressive weight pressing against the exterior walls. I reached the basement door, slowly twisting the knob to avoid the metallic squeak of the latch. I pulled it open and began to descend the wooden stairs. I placed my feet on the absolute edges of the steps, where the wood was sturdiest, avoiding the centers that tended to creak under my weight. Behind me, in the living room, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was a wet, sucking noise, like a massive vacuum hose being pressed against a pool of thick mud. But it wasn't just a sound. It was an absence of sound. It felt like the noise was physically pulling the air out of my ears. It's in the house, I thought, panic flaring like a supernova in my chest. It's in the room with him. I reached the bottom of the stairs. The basement was pitch black save for the small green LED light on the dehumidifier in the corner. I blindly navigated through the darkness, sweeping my hands through the freezing air until my fingers brushed the cold steel surface of the breaker panel. I popped the latch, grabbed the main 200-amp switch, and pulled it down with all my strength. The heavy clunk echoed loudly in the basement, followed instantly by the dying whine of the refrigerator upstairs and the click of the central air unit shutting off. Total, absolute darkness enveloped me. Power severed, I whispered into the dark, hoping he could somehow hear me. Step 2. Walter's voice came from directly beside my right ear. I clamped both hands over my mouth to stifle a scream. I spun around. I couldn't see him, but the smell of dry paper, metallic dust, and old wool was overwhelming. He had followed me down the stairs in complete, impossible silence. The entity is navigating the primary floor, Walter whispered, his voice sounding hollow and distorted, as if passing through a long tunnel. Depriving it of electricity will slow its mapping sequence, but it can smell the biological rhythm of your heartbeat. It can sense the electrical impulses of your nervous system. You must mask your organic signature. We need to create a localized paradox to confuse its sensors. How? I breathed, my lungs tight. Biological anchor. You must draw a specific sequence of symbols on the concrete floor. You must use your own DNA. Blood is the most efficient conductor of terrestrial reality. It holds the highest spatial weight. Blood? I backed away, my spine hitting the metal breaker box. I don't have anything sharp down here. Find something, he commanded. You have approximately 2 minutes before the entity breaches the basement door. I dropped to my hands and knees, frantically sweeping the dusty concrete floor. My fingers brushed against cardboard boxes, old paint cans, the rough wooden legs of a workbench I hadn't used in years. Then, a sharp, sudden pain pierced the pad of my index finger. I had found a rusty nail protruding from the base of the workbench leg. I didn't hesitate. Adrenaline had completely overridden my pain receptors. I pressed my finger harder against the jagged rust, feeling the skin break and the warm, thick trickle of blood run down my knuckle. I have it, I whispered. What do I draw? A circle, exactly 2 feet in diameter. Inside the circle, 2 horizontal lines intersecting 1 vertical line. Do not deviate from this geometry. It represents the architectural blueprint of a level 1 containment cell. It will trick the entity into registering this basement as a secure, pre-audited zone. It will think it is looking at an empty cage. I pressed my bleeding finger against the concrete. The floor was like a block of ice. I dragged my hand in a wide arc, estimating a 2-foot circle. I traced the blood heavily, reopening the wound on the rough concrete to ensure enough liquid was transferred to complete the shape. I drew the 2 horizontal lines, then the vertical one. Done, I gasped, clutching my throbbing hand to my chest. Step into the center of the circle, Walter instructed. Sit down, cross your legs. Do not let any part of your mass extend beyond the perimeter of the blood. I crawled into the center of the invisible circle, pulling my knees tight against my chest, wrapping my arms around my legs to make myself as compact as possible. Above us, the basement door opened. There was no creak of hinges. The door simply ceased to be shut. The temperature in the basement instantly dropped another 20 degrees. Frost began to rapidly crystallize on the surface of the washing machine next to me, emitting microscopic crackling sounds that echoed like gunfire in the silence. It is descending, Walter whispered, his voice barely registering above the threshold of human hearing. Final protocol. Total sensory deprivation. The entity feeds on output. If you produce sound, you will be consumed. If you produce light, you will be consumed. But its primary tracker at close range is the rhythmic expulsion of carbon dioxide. You must stop breathing. For how long? I mouthed, completely soundless. Until the audit is complete. I took a deep, desperate breath, filling my lungs to absolute maximum capacity, and clamped my uninjured hand over my mouth and nose. I squeezed my eyes shut, even though the basement was completely devoid of light. I waited. The descent of the cleaner was not something I heard. It was something I felt. The air pressure in the room began to fluctuate wildly, popping my ears painfully. I felt a heavy, oppressive wave of cold sliding down the wooden staircase, like dry ice spilling over the edge of a table, flowing across the concrete floor. It reached the bottom step. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, my lungs burning, expanding against my ribcage. The silence was absolute, but it was a heavy, aggressive silence. It felt like sitting at the bottom of a deep swimming pool, the water pressure crushing against my eardrums, threatening to rupture them. I felt it move past the workbench. It was slow, methodical, sweeping the area, tasting the dark. Then, the darkness shifted. Even with my eyes closed, I could perceive a localized void passing in front of me, a spot in the room where even the concept of space seemed to be missing, a blind spot in reality itself. It stopped right in front of the circle. My lungs were screaming. My blood was roaring in my ears, sounding like a jet engine. I was convinced the entity could hear my heart hammering against my sternum. The urge to exhale, to gasp for air, was a primal, burning agony in my chest. My vision behind my eyelids was exploding with white-hot flashes of static. I felt an intense, freezing pressure hover inches from my face. The smell of the room vanished. The metallic dust, the damp concrete, the copper scent of my own blood, it was all sucked away into an absolute olfactory void. It was inspecting me. It was staring right at me. "Don't breathe," I screamed at myself in my head. "Don't breathe, don't breathe, don't breathe." The agony in my lungs shifted from burning to a dull, heavy numbness. My brain was suffocating. I knew I was seconds away from passing out. If I lost consciousness, my autonomic nervous system would take over. I would gasp. I would fail. I would be erased. Suddenly, Walter spoke. Not to me, to the thing. "Audit complete." His voice echoed in the basement, but it was different. It was deafening. It was booming, carrying the weight and authority of an endless gray bureaucracy. "Sector secure. Containment holds. Proceed to next coordinate." The freezing pressure in front of my face violently retracted. There was a massive, concussive implosion of air, like a vacuum seal breaking. The pressure in my ears popped painfully, and a rush of normal, damp basement air flooded back into the space. I couldn't hold it anymore. I dropped my hands and gasped, sucking in a huge, jagged breath of air. I coughed violently, my lungs spasming, tears streaming down my face. I collapsed onto the concrete, gasping and heaving, my chest heaving against the cold floor. I laid there for a long time, listening to my own ragged breathing. The freezing cold had retreated. The oppressive, heavy silence was gone. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of the rain outside again. "Grandpa?" I wheezed, sitting up slowly in the dark. No answer. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, which I had forgotten I even had. I pulled it out and hit the power button. The harsh, bright light of the lock screen illuminated the concrete floor. It was 4:05 a.m. The lunar alignment window had closed. I shined the phone's flashlight around the basement. The space was completely empty. The washing machine, the workbench, the boxes, everything was normal. I looked down at the floor beneath me. The blood sigil was there, smeared and drying against the gray concrete. I slowly stood up, my legs shaking uncontrollably. I walked to the breaker box and flipped the main switch back on. The basement hummed to life. The overhead bulb flickered on, casting a dull yellow glow. The dehumidifier beeped. I walked upstairs. The living room was empty. My notebook was still on the table, the pens resting exactly where I left them. Toby was lying on the rug, curled up in a tight, shivering ball. As I walked in, his tail gave a weak, sleepy thump against the floor. He lifted his head, let out a long sigh, and went back to sleep. I walked over to the windows and pulled the blinds shut. I locked the front door. I checked every lock on every window in the house. Then I went to the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of bleach from under the sink, walked down to the basement, and scrubbed the concrete until my knuckles bled, erasing every trace of the biological anchor. It is now 9 a.m. The sun is up. The storm has passed. Toby is currently standing by the back door, whining to be let out to pee. He seems completely fine. He is a normal 70-pound mutt. But I am not fine. I am sitting at the dining table, staring at the notebooks. 32 yellow legal pads filled with the architecture of hell. Walter told me that the containment systems are failing. He told me that the administrative staff is overwhelmed. He told me that things are testing the perimeter. Last night, a defense mechanism from an endless subterranean prison beyond our reality breached my house because a dead man used my dog to warn me about the decay of the universe. I want to believe I'm crazy. I want to pack my bags, drive to a psychiatric hospital, check myself in, and tell them I'm having severe, complex hallucinations. I want to surrender to the idea that my brain chemistry is fundamentally broken. It would be so much easier. It would be safe. But when I was scrubbing the basement floor an hour ago, I noticed something I missed in the dark. Behind the workbench, right where the heavy, freezing pressure had descended from the stairs, the concrete wall was altered. It wasn't broken or smashed. It was perfectly, mathematically smoothed out. An area exactly 4 feet wide and 8 feet tall had been completely stripped of its texture, turning into a flawless, seamless slab of gray material that I couldn't scratch with a screwdriver. It looks exactly like the walls of a containment cell. There are 29 days until the next full moon. I am going to the hardware store today. I am going to buy a generator. I am going to buy heavy blackout curtains. I am going to buy industrial soundproofing foam for the basement. I don't think Walter is coming back. He broke protocol to save me. He spoke during an audit. I don't know what the penalty for that is in the facility, but I know the system is merciless. I am alone now. But I am the terrestrial anchor. Information is mass. By holding the knowledge, I solidify the containment. I am going to memorize the notebooks, every single sector, every single anomaly. I will learn the exact temperatures in Fahrenheit, the exact atmospheric pressures, the exact dimensions in feet and inches. I will hold the architecture of hell in my mind so tightly that reality has no choice but to obey it. I have to. Because while Toby was sleeping on the rug just a few minutes ago, the neighbor's cat walked across the porch. Toby didn't bark. He didn't even lift his head. He just opened his eyes, stared at the cat through the glass, and his front leg twitched. It wasn't a normal twitch. It was a sharp, mechanical jerk, like a joint snapping backward, like a book closing. The perimeter is testing. I have 29 days to reinforce the walls.